I want you to just picture yourself standing on Cemetery Ridge. It's July 1863.
Right, the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Exactly, the third day. And the ground is just physically vibrating beneath your boots. There are more than 150 Confederate cannons firing simultaneously.
Yeah, just hurling solid iron and explosive shells right into the Union lines.
It's terrifying. The smoke is so dense, it completely blocks out the summer sun. And you are standing there watching tens of thousands of men maneuver across this Pennsylvania farmland with this terrifying synchronized precision.
Mm-hmm. Directed by generals who just seem to intuitively anticipate each other's every single adjustment.
Right. And we look at this moment in history and we usually see a clash of opposing ideologies. But, when the smoke clears, a very different reality emerges.
A much more personal one.
Yeah. The commanders directing this massive scale of destruction, they didn't learn their trade in isolation. 16 years earlier, these exact same men shared the same campfires.
Oh, absolutely. They drank from the same canteens, they mapped the same hostile terrain, and they stormed the exact same stone walls.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. It fundamentally alters the entire lens through which we view the American Civil War. Because we are basically observing the bitter, lethal reunion of a single graduating class.
A graduating class that went to war against itself.
Exactly. The familiarity these officers had with one another wasn't just, historical trivia. It was the actual mechanism that made the tactics of 1863 even possible.
And that dynamic is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We are going to unpack how the Mexican-American War, which was fought between 1846 and 1848, served as this unintentional, incredibly brutal military academy.
A proving ground.
Yeah, it was the crucible that forged the most consequential generation of officers in American history. We will really explore how the deep personal friendships and, the tactical lessons forged in the deserts and mountains of Mexico directly created the intensely intimate and staggeringly bloody battlefields of the Civil War.
And to build this picture for you, we are pulling from a pretty dense stack of sources today.
We really are.
We are examining official U.S. government campaign reports from the 1840s. We've got historical syntheses, like the book The Training Ground and A Wicked War, plus public history archives curated by the American Battlefield Trust and the National Park Service. And perhaps most crucially, we're leaning heavily on primary accounts, especially Ulysses S. Grant's own personal memoirs,
which are just incredible to read. But before we put these future legends on a battlefield, we need to understand the map they were walking onto.
Right, the bigger picture.
So if we rewind to 1846, what is the actual geopolitical reality driving this conflict?
Well, the foundational context here is that this was, at its core, a war of territorial conquest.
Right.
In the 1840s, the United States was completely gripped by manifest destiny.
That idea that they were meant to take over the continent.
Exactly. The prevailing political and cultural belief that the nation was providentially ordained to expand its borders from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
But doing that isn't just about drawing a line on a map.
No, not at all. Fulfilling that specific geographic vision required taking immense tracts of land that already belonged to a sovereign nation.
The Republic of Mexico.
Exactly. Now, this conflict ultimately expanded U.S. territory by roughly a third, which secured what we now know as the American Southwest and California.
Huge chunks of land.
Massive. But securing that land meant intentionally pushing troops into disputed border zones to provoke a response, and then launching a full-scale, multi-front invasion of a neighboring country.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the very beginning of the fighting. We are down at the Rio Grande. It's May of 1846.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the U.S. Congress hasn't even formally debated a declaration of war yet.
But the shooting has already started.
Yeah, exactly. Leading the American forces in this initial northern campaign is Major General Zachary Taylor.
And Zachary Taylor's is a fascinating figure to start with. I mean, his men called him Old Rough and Ready.
Which is a great nickname.
Oh, it fit him perfectly. He absolutely loathed military formality. He often commanded troops wearing a battered straw hat and just a simple, dusty civilian coat instead of a regulation uniform.
So not a stickler for the rules.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And the volunteer troops adored him for it because he didn't care about spit and polish. He cared about holding the line.
Right.
So Taylor is commanding the regular army down near the Texas-Mexico border, and he immediately clashes with the Mexican army at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma.
And these two initial battles feature this massive technological surprise. The U.S. Army deploys a tactical innovation that completely stuns the Mexican commanders.
Yeah, it changed everything.
We are talking about flying artillery. Let's
Ah.
break down the actual mechanics of that, because I think when we picture 19th century cannons, we usually picture these massive, heavy iron tubes, right?
Like the kind that take an hour just to drag to the top of a hill.
Yeah, and then they sit parked there for the rest of the day.
Well, that was the traditional European model. Artillery was heavy, it was slow, and it was mostly static. And the Mexican army was operating on those older doctrines.
But the Americans had something else.
Exactly. The U.S. Army had spent the previous decade secretly developing something entirely new. They cast lightweight cannons out of bronze instead of iron.
Okay, so much later.
Much lighter. And they mounted them on these reinforced, highly mobile carriages. But the real key was that they hitched them to teams of 6 exceptionally well-trained horses.
Wow, 6 horses per cannon.
Yeah. And the gunners themselves actually rode on the horses or on the ammunition chests. This meant an entire battery of cannons could move across the battlefield at a full gallop.
So they are matching the speed of a cavalry charge.
Literally matching cavalry speed, yes.
Let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. What does it physically look like when these cannons actually engage in a battle?
So imagine the battery spots a vulnerability in the enemy line. They gallop at top speed directly to that location.
It's just charging in.
Right. And in a matter of seconds, the crews jump down, they unhitch the horses, which is a process called unlimbering. They spin the bronze barrel toward the enemy, load, and fire.
All in seconds.
Seconds. They could unleash several rounds a minute into massed infantry formations. And the moment the enemy tried to organize any kind of counterattack, the crews would just hitch the cannons back to the horses and gallop away to a new vantage point.
Man, it reminds me of a basketball team suddenly introducing a revolutionary fast break offense while the opposing team is still trying to set up the slow, methodical half-court defense.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because the pace of the engagement is entirely dictated by the faster team. And the Mexican infantry formations were fighting in traditional dense lines, right?
Yes, shoulder to shoulder.
Which made them just massive targets for this highly mobile artillery.
And the resulting devastation at Palo Alto was profound. I mean, the Mexican lines were just shattered from a distance before they could even bring their muskets into effective range.
Which is devastating for morale.
Utterly devastating. It forced the Mexican army to retreat south, deeper into their own country.
And Taylor follows them.
He does. And by September 1846, his army reaches the city of Monterrey. And here, the nature of the war fundamentally changes.
Because Monterrey isn't an open field where horses can gallop around.
No.
It's a fortified city.
It is an urban fortress. And the Mexican defenders utilized the city's architecture brilliantly. They barricaded the streets. They placed snipers on the flat rooftops.
So they have the high ground everywhere.
Everywhere. And they even knocked loopholes into the thick adobe walls of the houses so they could fire directly into the avenues while remaining completely undercover.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so when Taylor's troops tried to march down the streets in their standard formations, they were instantly caught in deadly crossfires. It was an absolute slaughter.
So they realize immediately that staying in the open streets is essentially suicide.
Right.
And the sources detail how the American soldiers had to invent modern urban warfare on the fly.
They really did.
Instead of moving horizontally down the road, they start moving laterally through the buildings.
Yes.
They would literally break down the front door of an adobe house on the edge of town, clear it in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and then face a shared interior wall connecting to the next house.
And rather than going back out into the deadly street to access that next building, they utilized a tactic we now call mouse-holing.
Mouse-holing?
Yeah. They used pickaxes, crowbars, and even unexploded artillery shells to physically blast holes through the shared interior walls.
That is intense.
Very. They would literally crawl through the rubble into the next living room, fight the defenders there, and just repeat the process block by block.
It sounds like a terrifying, claustrophobic nightmare of a battle.
It was horrific.
You were fighting through adobe dust, in the dark, room by room, never knowing what is on the other side of a plaster wall. And this grinding, block-by-block siege directly foreshadows the brutal trench and siege tactics these exact same men will eventually use in the Civil War at places like Vicksburg and Petersburg.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And caught right in the middle of this urban meat grinder at Monterrey is a young lieutenant serving as a regimental quartermaster.
A quartermaster?
Yeah, a role that is theoretically supposed to keep him safely in the rear, managing the supply mules and the baggage trains.
But we are talking about Ulysses S. Grant.
We are talking about Ulysses S. Grant.
So he doesn't stay in the rear.
Of course not. During the deepest push into the city, the forward assault elements start running critically low on ammunition. The fighting is so intense, they realize they are going to be overrun if they don't get resupplied immediately.
Someone needs to ride back to headquarters to get more powder and lead.
And Grant volunteers.
And the account from his memoirs of how he executes this ride is just incredible. He doesn't just sit upright in the saddle and gallop down a street swarming with snipers.
No, that would have gotten him killed instantly.
Right. So he utilizes a trick he likely observed from Native American riders on the western frontier. Grant slides completely out of the saddle. He leaves only one foot hooked in the stirrup, grabs his horse's mane, and hangs his entire body down against the side of the horse's flank.
It's an amazing visual.
He uses the galloping animal as a massive moving shield between his own body and the bullets raining down from the rooftops. And he manages to ride through the crossfire, deliver the message, and actually secure the ammunition.
It demonstrates just an astonishing level of physical nerve and horsemanship from Grant.
Truly.
And that nerve is tested on an army-wide scale a few months later in February 1847 at the Battle of Buena Vista.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, Zachary Taylor's northern campaign reaches its absolute limit here. The Mexican commanding general Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna marches a massive army north and catches Taylor in a narrow mountain pass.
And Taylor is vastly outnumbered, right?
Vastly. He's facing odds of 3 or 4 to 1.
So the American army is pushed to the absolute brink of collapse.
They are.
The volunteer regiments are breaking under the sheer mathematical weight of the Mexican assaults. But the line is saved by two specific tactical maneuvers, executed by two men who will later become massive figures in the Confederacy.
Right.
First, we have Colonel Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis, who becomes the future president of the Confederate States.
Right.
At Buena Vista, Davis is commanding a volunteer regiment known as the Mississippi Rifles, and they are armed with percussion rifles, which are much more accurate and reliable than standard muskets.
Mm-hmm.
During a critical moment, a massive Mexican cavalry charge threatens to break the American flank. Now, Davis is actually bleeding from a severe wound to his foot at this point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but he refuses to be evacuated. Instead, he reorganizes his men into a V-shaped defensive formation, with the open end of the V facing the charging cavalry.
Let's talk about the geometry of that for a second, because it's a brilliant tactical track.
It really is.
If you are charging horses into the opening of that V, you aren't just taking fire from the front. You are taking enfilading fire, crossfire, from the left and the right simultaneously.
Exactly.
The Mississippi Rifles channel the cavalry right into a kill zone.
And it shatters the momentum of the charge entirely.
But the battle isn't over.
No, the battle is still hanging by a thread. Santa Anna launches one final, massive infantry assault against the center of the American line. And if this line breaks, Taylor's entire army is destroyed.
So who steps up?
Enter a young artillery captain named Braxton Bragg.
Bragg brings his flying artillery up to the absolute front line.
Right to the front.
They unlimber the guns at point-blank range, practically staring the advancing Mexican infantry in the face.
And Zachary Taylor supposedly rides up through the smoke behind Bragg's guns and delivers one of the most famous orders in American military history.
What does he say?
He says, "A little more grape, Captain Bragg."
Now, I want to clarify what grape means in this context, because we aren't talking about solid cannonballs here.
No, we are talking about grape shot or canister shot.
All right.
Instead of loading a single heavy iron ball intended to smash a fort or bounce through a line, the artillerymen load a tin cylinder filled with dozens of smaller iron balls.
Like a giant shotgun shell.
Exactly like a massive shotgun. When the cannon fires, the tin casing shreds, and firing canister shot at point-blank range into a dense infantry formation is just unimaginably destructive.
Awful.
Bragg's guns unleash continuous volleys of this iron hail, and it completely breaks the final Mexican assault. Taylor wins the battle.
And Buena Vista basically turns Zachary Taylor into an absolute superstar back in the United States.
An icon.
Yeah, his gritty, lead-from-the-front image makes him a national hero, which ultimately propels him to the White House in 1848.
But there is a massive political complication here.
Of course there is.
The current president, James K. Polk, is watching this happen, and he is terrified.
Because Polk is a savvy, highly partisan politician.
Very much so.
He sees a victorious general becoming wildly popular with the voting public, and he perceives Taylor as a direct political threat to his administration.
Right.
Furthermore, Polk is frustrated because, after the brutal urban fighting at Monterey, Taylor had agreed to an armistice that allowed the Mexican army to retreat intact, rather than pursuing and destroying them.
Polk did not like that at all.
So Polk decides he needs to sideline Taylor. He halts the Northern campaign, leaves Taylor with a holding force, and decides to open an entirely new second front in the war.
Which means giving command to a completely different type of general.
Right. We leave old Rough and Ready behind, and we are introduced to Major General Winfield Scott.
And if Zachary Taylor is the guy in the dirty straw hat chewing tobacco, Winfield Scott is the guy known as Old Fuss and Feathers.
Old Fuss and Feathers.
Exactly. Scott insists on immaculate, gold-braided uniforms, strict parade ground discipline, and complete adherence to formal military theory.
So polar opposite.
Complete opposites. And in March of 1847, Scott executes what is essentially a strategic masterstroke. He launches a massive amphibious landing just south of the walled Mexican port city of Veracruz, bringing 10,000 men ashore.
Now, to contextualize the scale of this, it is the largest amphibious operation in American history up to that point.
It was unprecedented.
And the mechanics of pulling it off without modern technology are staggering. They don't have Higgins boats or modern landing craft.
No, they are using specially designed flat-bottomed surf boats.
And they have to row thousands of men, hundreds of heavy horses, and these massive artillery pieces through the ocean swell and onto a hostile beach.
And once Scott is on the beach, he doesn't just blindly charge the walls of Veracruz. He applies his formal military education.
Because Scott understands the mathematics of the siege.
He does.
He knows a frontal assault against stone walls would result in massive American casualties. So instead, he directs his engineers to dig formal siege trenches. Now, let's explain how you dig a trench toward an enemy who is actively shooting at you, because you can't just walk out there with a shovel.
Right. That'll be the death sentence.
Yeah.
So you utilize a technique called sapping.
Sapping.
Yeah. You start completely out of musket range and dig a trench parallel to the enemy wall. Then, from that safe trench, you dig a zigzagging trench forward.
Why zigzagging?
Because the zigzag pattern ensures the enemy can't fire a cannonball straight down the length of your ditch.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
Exactly. Once you get close enough, you dig another parallel trench, move your heavy siege guns into it, and start bombarding the city walls from point-blank range.
Just a methodical, mathematical approach.
And Scott executes this perfectly. He methodically reduces the defenses of Veracruz until the city surrenders, and he keeps his own casualties incredibly low.
So from Veracruz, Scott has to march his army inland, up into the mountains, toward Mexico City.
Yes, a grueling march.
Now, I want to pause here and challenge something, because we've talked about grand strategy, amphibious landings, and artillery tactics.
Okay.
During this entire march inland, Ulysses S. Grant is still working as a quartermaster.
He is.
He is counting barrels of hardtack, securing forage for mules, managing supply wagons. Why should we care about the administrative paperwork of a war?
We must care because of the old military truth. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics.
Right.
I mean, you can have the most brilliant battlefield strategy in the world, but if your men haven't eaten in 3 days and your horses are dying of thirst, your army simply ceases to exist.
It's like trying to run a massive moving corporation, but doing it in a hostile desert with no telegraphs or paved roads.
That is the exact reality.
Yeah.
10,000 men consume an astronomical amount of calories every single day. Thousands of horses and mules require thousands of pounds of grain and forage.
It's a lot of weight to move.
Massive amounts.
Yeah.
Disease, broken wagon wheels, spoiled meat, these are the actual enemies that destroy armies. Grant's tenure as a quartermaster was the most vital education of his entire life. He learned the unglamorous, brutal mathematics of keeping an army alive and moving.
And he also spent this time observing his commanders, right?
Constantly observing.
He watched Winfield Scott's meticulous, staff-driven polish, and he remembered Zachary Taylor's unpretentious, instinctual grit. And Grant actually noted in his memoirs that he preferred Taylor's leadership style.
He did?
He realized, you don't need a plumed hat to command respect. You need to ensure your men are fed, ensure they have ammunition, and never stop moving forward.
Exactly.
The logistical brilliance Grant later deployed to win the Civil War, like cutting his supply lines at Vicksburg or maintaining that relentless pressure during the Overland Campaign, was entirely learned managing mules in Mexico.
And while Grant is mastering the science of supply, another officer in Scott's army is mastering a completely different, yet equally vital discipline.
Who are we talking about now?
Scott's star engineer, a captain named Robert E. Lee.
Right. So the inland march hits a massive roadblock in April 1847 at the mountain pass of Cerro Gordo. Santa Anna has entrenched his Mexican army on the high ground overlooking the only road. A frontal assault up the road would be a complete suicide mission.
It would be impossible.
So Scott calls up his engineers.
Because Scott needs a way around the blockade. So he sends Captain Lee out into the wilderness to find a flanking route.
And let's define chaparral, because this isn't just a pleasant hike in the woods.
Oh, far from it.
Lee is navigating through dense, thorny, near-impenetrable brush over jagged volcanic rock under a blazing sun.
Right.
He is literally crawling on his hands and knees, dragging heavy surveying equipment, and often operating so close to the Mexican lines he can hear the sentries talking.
He's right on top of them.
Yeah, he is looking for a path that the Mexican engineers have already deemed physically impassable.
It's akin to a master lockpicker feeling for the one faulty tumbler inside a massive vault door.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
The Mexican command assumed their left flank, the side of their army resting against the roughest terrain, was naturally protected by the sheer cliffs and ravines.
They thought no one could get through.
Exactly. But Lee uses his deep spatial intuition and his engineering training to map a hidden, treacherous goat path that leads entirely around the Mexican position.
And Lee actually guides the American infantry down this invisible path.
He does.
They appear in the rear of the Mexican army, completely collapsing their defensive line.
Total surprise.
Yeah. And General Scott publicly praises Lee's reconnaissance as the absolute key to the victory.
And this specific capability, the ability to read topography better than anyone else, to personally scout and find the hidden dagger's path to the enemy's weak point, becomes Lee's signature.
It's the exact same spatial genius he will use to humiliate the Union Army at battles like Chancellorsville.
Exactly. So you see the foundational blocks being laid here. Grant learns how to feed the beast of the army. Lee learns how to maneuver it through impossible terrain.
And throughout the brutal summer of 1847, Scott's army fights its way into the Valley of Mexico.
They endure vicious battles at Contreras, Churubusco, and Molino del Rey.
Just a relentless, exhausting campaign.
And it finally brings them, in September, to the absolute gates of Mexico City. And guarding the western approach to the capital is the fortress of Chapultepec.
Now, Chapultepec is a towering stone castle perched on top of a steep 200-foot hill.
It's incredibly intimidating.
To take the capital, the Americans have to take the castle. This requires infantry to run up the exposed steep slopes under heavy artillery and musket fire.
While carrying heavy wooden scaling ladders.
Right. They have to prop them against the stone walls and climb up into hand-to-hand combat. It is archaic, brutal, deeply personal warfare.
And this battle on September 13th, 1847, provides some of the most enduring and tragic imagery of the entire war.
Let's put a magnifying glass on one specific moment on that hillside. The American infantry is surging up the slope. Leading the charge for his regiment, carrying the heavy regimental battle flag, is a young lieutenant named James Longstreet.
Right, Longstreet.
He is completely exposed, leading from the very front. Suddenly, a Mexican musket ball tears into his thigh. Longstreet collapses, bleeding heavily onto the slope.
But as he falls, he refuses to let the colors hit the dirt. He thrusts the flag upward.
And running right beside him in the charge is his absolute best friend in the army, another young lieutenant.
His closest confidant.
Yeah, he sees Longstreet go down, reaches out, and grabs the flagpole from Longstreet's hands. He leaves his friend on the ground, continues the charge through the smoke, and carries that flag up the scaling ladders and over the wall of Chapultepec.
And that friend was George Pickett.
George Pickett. It is a moment of profound cinematic heroism.
It really is.
Yeah.
Two young men, bonded by the shared trauma of a long campaign, physically handing off the symbol of their unit in the absolute heat of battle. And they weren't the only ones defining their character that day.
No, over in the artillery lines supporting the assault, there's a lieutenant named Thomas J. Jackson.
Yes.
His battery is caught in a devastating crossfire. The incoming fire is so heavy that his supporting infantry actually takes cover in a ditch.
They just hunker down.
Right. Several of his gunners are killed. The sheer volume of lead is practically tearing the ground apart.
But Jackson refuses to pull his cannons back.
And he refuses to take cover.
He stands alone, completely exposed in the open field, calmly walking among his guns. He's checking the elevation and shouting orders to the surviving crew.
He paces back and forth, showing zero physical reaction to the bullets snapping past him.
He's actually attempting to shame the hiding infantry into returning to the fight through his sheer, unshakable nerve.
And that icy mechanical courage under fire is exactly what, 14 years later at the First Battle of Bull Run, will prompt another officer to point at him and shout that he is standing like a stone wall.
Stonewall Jackson.
Exactly. Now we also have to track Grant during this climax.
Right, because while the castle is falling, Grant is pushing with a detachment toward the San Cosme Gate, trying to fight his way into the actual city streets.
And he encounters a heavily defended Mexican barricade sweeping the road with fire. The American advance is completely stalled out.
And Grant realizes a frontal push will just result in dead soldiers.
Right.
So he looks around the urban environment and notices a church situated just off the road. And it possesses a high, sturdy stone belfry that overlooks the Mexican barricade.
So Grant demonstrates this incredible capacity for tactical improvisation.
He really does.
He requisitions a mountain howitzer. Now let's clarify what that is, because they aren't dragging a massive field cannon up a flight of stairs. Right?
No, a mountain howitzer is a smaller, specialized artillery piece designed to be broken down and carried by pack mules over rough terrain.
But it's still heavy.
Oh, definitely. The bronze barrel alone still weighs over 250 pounds.
Man. So Grant orders his men to completely disassemble the howitzer.
Right.
They carry the heavy bronze barrel, the wooden carriage, the wheels, and the heavy ammunition boxes by hand, lugging them up the narrow, winding stone staircase of the church tower.
It must have been exhausting.
They reassemble the cannon inside the belfry, knock out the louvers, and suddenly start raining explosive shells straight down onto the heads of the Mexican defenders behind the barricade.
And the defenders are completely routed.
It is a brilliant, unorthodox solution to a tactical stalemate, and it earns Grant a brevet promotion.
Well deserved.
And the compounding effect of all these actions culminates the very next day. On September 14th, 1847, the American flag is raised over the National Palace in Mexico City.
Winfield Scott has achieved the impossible.
He really has.
He has marched a small army deep into hostile territory, completely severed from his own supply lines on the coast, and captured an enemy capital containing a population vastly larger than his entire force.
It is a stunning professional triumph. But if we pull back and look at the larger historical timeline, the most consequential thing these junior officers took out of Mexico wasn't territory.
No, it wasn't.
The most consequential thing they took was a deeply intimate understanding of each other's psychology.
Exactly. They spent 2 years marching, starving, bleeding, and executing complex tactics together. They observed how every single man reacted under the extreme pressure of combat. They learned who was meticulous, who was reckless, who panicked when their flank was turned, and who could be relied upon to hold a position at all costs.
The Mexican War functionally served as a psychological laboratory. The mental blueprint of every future Civil War general was documented in the memories of his peers.
And when we flash forward to 1861, they weaponized that intimate knowledge against each other.
Which brings us back to the image you painted at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg.
The historical irony of Gettysburg is agonizing when you know the backstory. Remember the slopes of Chapultepec?
Oh, yeah.
James Longstreet taking a bullet, falling, and handing the flag to his best friend, George Pickett.
It's heartbreaking.
16 years later, James Longstreet is Robert E. Lee's senior corps commander. And on the third day of Gettysburg, Lee devises a massive, desperate frontal assault against the center of the Union line.
And Longstreet evaluates the terrain and is horrified.
He argues vehemently against the attack.
He knows the Union artillery will slaughter the advancing infantry. But Lee is adamant the order stands.
And the commander, Longstreet, is ordered to send across that mile of open ground directly into the concentrated fire of the Union cannons is George Pickett.
Right. Longstreet is forced by military duty to send the very man who caught his flag in Mexico into an absolute tactical meat grinder.
We really have to consider the psychological torment of that. But it isn't just Pickett and Longstreet. Let's look at the Union commanders waiting on Cemetery Ridge to receive that exact same charge.
Okay.
The center of the Union defense, the troops who are pouring rifle and cannon fire into Pickett's advancing men, is commanded by General Winfield Scott Hancock.
And one of the Confederate brigade commanders walking on foot across that field, leading his men directly toward Hancock's blazing cannons, is General Lewis Armistead.
And Hancock and Armistead weren't just colleagues.
No, they were practically brothers in the old pre-war army. They served together in Mexico. When the Civil War broke out and they had to resign their commissions to fight for opposing sides, The historical accounts note that Armistead was weeping openly at their farewell party.
Wow.
He literally told Hancock he hoped God would strike him dead before he ever had to lift a sword against him.
And at Gettysburg, Armistead manages to lead a small remnant of his men over the low Stonewall, temporarily breaching the Union line before he is shot down.
Right at the wall.
As he lies mortally wounded on the battlefield, the primary sources record that he asked the capturing Union soldiers about the condition of his old friend, Hancock.
Because Hancock had also been severely wounded just yards away.
It is a profoundly tragic story, and it highlights a grim reality about the Civil War. The shared combat experience in Mexico allowed these officers to refine their command tactics, but that same familiarity made the ensuing civil conflict exceptionally lethal.
Exactly. I mean, if you are commanding an army, and you know the general across the river is naturally overly cautious because you shared a tent with him for months in Mexico, you know exactly how to bluff him.
Right. Or if you know he is hot-headed and desperate for glory, you know exactly how to bait him into a trap.
The intimacy did not breed hesitation or mercy. It bred a cold, calculating lethality.
Yeah.
They knew exactly where to insert the knife because they knew exactly how the other man thought.
Here is where we need to pivot, though, because the story of the Mexican-American War is not just a story of tactical brilliance, engineering marvels, and tragic brotherhoods.
No, it's not.
There is a deeply dark shadow side to this conflict. And as we explore this, we are going to look strictly at the historical facts and the primary accounts, remaining completely impartial because the conduct of the occupying forces was incredibly complex and, in many cases, horrific.
While irregular Army officers, men like Grant, Lee, and Taylor, were trained professionals operating under strict military codes, a massive portion of the United States forces consisted of volunteer regiments raised by individual states.
And the historical syntheses and court-martial records make it clear that the occupation of Mexico was frequently characterized by severe brutality against the civilian population.
Yes. We are talking about documented widespread atrocities. Volunteer units operating away from the main columns routinely engaged in robbery, the destruction of Catholic churches, rape, and the outright murder of Mexican non-combatants.
And the regular Army officers were appalled by this.
Absolutely appalled. Grant wrote scathingly about the behavior of the volunteers.
Didn't Winfield Scott have to step in?
He did. Winfield Scott had to implement martial law and create military tribunals specifically to prosecute his own soldiers for crimes against civilians.
Wow.
This breakdown in discipline was heavily fueled by a virulent racial and cultural contempt. Many of the American volunteers brought intense pre-existing prejudices with them.
Right.
They viewed the Mexican population as racially inferior, which they used to mentally justify unleashing violence upon people who were not combatants.
And that intense cultural, racial, and religious friction within the Army itself leads us to one of the most complex, debated, and frankly astonishing stories of the entire war.
San Patricios.
The St. Patrick's Battalion.
Right. The San Patricios were a unit of several hundred soldiers, predominantly Irish and German Catholic immigrants, who were initially serving in the United States Army.
But they didn't just mutiny.
No, they deserted the U.S. military, crossed enemy lines, and officially joined the Mexican Army to fight against the United States.
Which is just, wow.
They fought under a green silk flag, emblazoned with a harp and a shamrock, and they were led by an Irish immigrant named John Riley.
Let's stop and analyze the mechanics of this decision for a second. Why would a man who recently immigrated to America seeking a new life, join the U.S. Army, march all the way to Mexico, and then suddenly decide to risk a firing squad by defecting to the enemy?
It really requires unpacking a very dense web of divided loyalties.
Okay, let's unpack it.
First, we must understand the physical reality of the 1840s U.S. Army. Discipline was incredibly harsh, often crossing the line into actual physical torture.
Right.
Minor infractions could result in soldiers being flogged with a whip or being bucked and gagged, which meant being tied in excruciating stress positions for hours.
Add to that the severe cultural climate of the 1840s.
Exactly.
The United States was heavily dominated by Protestant culture, and there was massive open nativism and anti-Catholic prejudice directed at the waves of incoming immigrants.
We are talking about an era where anti-Catholic riots were actively burning churches in places like Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Many of these immigrant soldiers faced relentless discrimination, verbal abuse, and unfair punishments from their native-born Protestant officers.
So you take these marginalized, abused soldiers, you march them into a foreign country, and what do they see?
They see a Catholic nation.
Right. They see familiar Catholic churches, Catholic priests, and a familiar religious culture.
And the Mexican government recognized this vulnerability. They actively distributed propaganda across the lines, appealing directly to their shared faith and offering them massive land grants and officer commissions if they defected.
So for some, desertion was simply a pragmatic escape from a brutal U.S. command structure. But the sources suggest that for many, there was a genuine moral and religious conviction at play. They began to view the American invasion not as a just war, but as an aggressive Protestant empire trying to crush a fellow Catholic republic.
And regardless of their primary motivation, once they crossed the lines, they fought with astonishing ferocity.
Because they had everything to lose.
Everything. They served as elite artillerymen for the Mexican army. And they fought particularly hard because they understood the absolute finality of their situation. At the Battle of Churubusco in August 1847, the San Patricios physically tore down the white flags of surrender that Mexican troops tried to raise.
Wait, really?
Yes. They forced the battle to continue into brutal hand-to-hand combat because the San Patricios knew exactly what the U.S. Army would do to them if they were captured alive.
And many of them were captured when Churubusco finally fell.
Unfortunately for them, yes.
Which brings us to the severe, highly publicized reckoning. The U.S. Army convened general courts-martial and ultimately condemned some 50 of these deserters to death by hanging.
And the mechanics of the executions were designed to be as psychologically impactful as possible. It was a grim, systematic timeline.
What was the timeline?
16 men were hanged at the plaza in San Angel on September 10th. 4 more were hanged at Mixcoac on September 11th.
Okay.
But the final 30 men were reserved for a highly theatrical execution on September 13th, designed to coincide exactly with the climax of the assault on the castle of Chapultepec.
The primary accounts of this final execution are just chilling. The executions were overseen by Colonel William Harney.
Yes.
He ordered the 30 condemned men brought out to a massive gallows built on a rise outside the city. He had the nooses placed around their necks, but he didn't give the order to drop them.
No, he made them wait.
He made them stand on the trapdoors, bound and hooded, facing the distant hill of Chapultepec.
Harney ordered that the trapdoors would not be released until the precise second the American flag was seen rising over the captured castle.
Just brutal.
He forced these men to stand with nooses around their necks, listening to the roar of the artillery in the distance, waiting to physically witness the final defeat of the Mexican army they had chosen to fight for.
And the moment the Stars and Stripes crested the walls of Chapultepec, Harney gave the signal, and the 30 men were dropped.
To this day, it remains the largest mass execution in United States military history.
We also have to track the fate of their commander, John Riley, because in a dark twist of legal technicality, he actually escapes the gallows.
He does. The military court reviewed Riley's specific case and determined that he had officially deserted just before the U.S. Congress formally declared war on Mexico.
Ah, loophole.
Because he defected during peacetime, military law dictated he could not be executed for treason.
But the Army ensured he suffered terribly. He was subjected to the maximum physical punishment allowed.
Yes.
He was tied to a whipping post and lashed severely. Then he was physically branded on the cheek with a red-hot iron in the shape of a 2-inch letter D, permanently marking him as a deserter.
And the legacy of the San Patricios remains a profound historical debate even now.
Oh, for sure.
Were they principled martyrs standing up against a war of unjust aggression, defending their faith? Or were they simply opportunists and mutineers trying to secure a better paycheck and escape a tough army?
The nuanced historical truth probably encompasses both realities, but their story forces us to grapple with a fundamental question of morality in warfare.
Absolutely.
Who defines a traitor in a war of expansion? Does a soldier's ultimate loyalty belong to the uniform he swore an oath to, or to his own conscience if he concludes that the war he is ordered to fight is fundamentally unjust?
And that exact question of conscience brings us directly back to the officer who learned the most from this war.
Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes, we arrive at the central, incredible contradiction of this deep dive.
Which is fascinating.
The man who absorbed the logistical mechanics of warfare in Mexico. The man who used those very skills to save the United States from shattering during the Civil War, is also the man who condemned the Mexican-American War more harshly than almost any other prominent figure of his generation.
If we crack open Grant's personal memoirs, which, remember, he wrote decades later, racing against time as he was dying of throat cancer, His assessment is breathtakingly blunt.
He strips away all the romanticism of the conflict.
He does. He explicitly states, and I quote, "I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation."
Grant viewed the conflict not as a triumph of manifest destiny, but as a blatant, cynical land grab.
Right.
He believed a democratic republic was behaving with the corrupt aggression of a European empire. But this presents a profound psychological dilemma for Grant. Well, how does a man reconcile the fact that his entire foundational military education, his rise to prominence, and the expansion of his country were all built upon a war he believes was deeply immoral?
He reconciles it by viewing American history through a lens of almost biblical tragedy.
Yes, exactly.
Grant concluded that the unimaginable, horrific scale of slaughter during the American Civil War was not merely a political crisis over secession. He viewed it as the nation's divine punishment for its sins in Mexico.
He connects the mechanics of the two wars directly. By invading a weaker neighbor to conquer massive new territories, the United States reopened the explosive political debate over whether slavery would be allowed to expand into those new Western lands.
And that debate broke the country in half.
Right. Grant believed the nation had incurred a massive moral debt in 1846, and the oceans of blood spilled at Antietam, at Shiloh, and at Gettysburg were the terrifying, necessary payment of that debt.
It is an incredibly heavy, somber framework for understanding history, but we have to recognize that Grant's stark moral clarity was not shared by all of his peers.
No, not at all. Memory is a highly selective instrument, especially when it is shaped by trauma and later loyalties.
Right.
While Grant stared directly at the moral ugliness of the conflict, many other veterans from both the North and the South chose to remember the Mexican-American War purely as a tale of glorious, professional triumph.
Yeah, in the decades following the Civil War, they looked back on Mexico as basically the golden days of their youth.
It was a time when the Army was united, victorious, and fighting a foreign enemy, rather than slaughtering their own brothers.
It forces us to ask a critical question about how history is written. How much of this training ground narrative, the idea that the Civil War generals were perfectly reading each other's minds at Gettysburg because they shared a campfire in Mexico, is concrete, mechanical, historical fact? And how much of it is a satisfying, romanticized story that the traumatized survivors imposed on themselves afterward to make sense of the carnage?
Well, the historical evidence confirms the tactical lessons were absolutely real.
Right, the mechanics.
The mechanics of siege warfare, the logistics of moving armies, the speed of artillery, those are concrete tools forged in Mexico and deployed in the Civil War. But the romantic brotherhood narrative is certainly colored by a desperate need to find meaning in the tragedy of the 1860s.
And that brings us to the perfect thought to close on. When you study the granular details of the Mexican-American War, you see clearly how the environments we train in, the grueling lessons we absorb, and most importantly, the people we sweat and bleed alongside, shape the tools we rely on in the future.
Exactly.
Sometimes we use those tools to build something entirely new, and sometimes, tragically, we use those exact same tools to destroy the very things and the very people we once stood beside.
It really leaves us with a lingering, profound counterfactual to ponder on your own time.
Yeah, think about this.
Consider the young lieutenants and captains we track today. Grant, Lee, Longstreet, Jackson, Hancock, Armistead. If they had never been sent into the heat of Mexico, if they had never learned the lethal mechanics of flying artillery together, if they hadn't mastered the terror of urban combat or the cold math of supply lines side by side,
would the American Civil War have been as tactically brilliant, as prolonged, and as devastating?
did the deep friendships forged in the triumph of 1847 absolutely guarantee the unprecedented, unimaginable scale of slaughter in 1863?
It is a question that completely shifts how you view the architecture of American history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.